This year marks the 50th birthday of your favourite Sunday World newspaper. To celebrate, we're looking back over some of the front page stories and the scandals with the big name journalists who made it the people's paper. So join us to reel in the years over the coming weeks on Crime World and at a special 50th birthday party event to be held on September 27th at the Sugar Club in Dublin. We have 50 tickets to give away. For information on how to enter, go to our Crime World social media channels on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. Sunday World is 50, a Crime World special. Start with the night that you named the General, and I suppose we'll go back then afterwards to the build-up to that. But
yeah,
that story you just told me off air there about...
Well, we've been working on the whole story about Martin Cahill and the General for several months, and at that time, you know, he was living in a big house down in Cooper Downs in Rathmines, which was a real posh part of Dublin and still is, and the General was living there and his pigeons out the back, and he had his wife there, Frances, and his girlfriend was living, her sister up the road, Tina, was living, I think, up around the Swan House. I can't remember, it was Swan something. Anyway. She was up the road. But, you know, everyone wondered how was this man who was on social welfare was living in such a big pad in one of the poshest parts of Dublin. And I suppose that's what kind of got our interest. And the Sunday World in those days was an amazing place to work, and there was a real buzz about the place. And we had the most fantastic news editor in Sean Boyne. He was a brilliant man. And also Dave Mullins, his deputy, was an amazing character and a very nice guy, but a brilliant tabloid writer. And also a great man to see his story. And in those days, there was a lot of resources there. And the Sunday World would have no problem putting a couple of reporters on the Cahill story. So I would have worked in it. Cahill O'Shea at the time would have worked in it. And there was a couple of other people who gave us a hand on this particular story. You know, everyone wanted to know who this guy, the General, was. And why had he so much money when he never worked a day in his life? And, you know, so the cops had put a team on him to basically follow him 24 hours and to see how and where he was getting his money. And eventually he was done for social welfare fraud, effectively. So he ended up in court a couple of times, and one of the days he showed up dressed as Mickey Mouse in his Mickey Mouse boxer shorts and mask over his face, all of that down the courts.
And had he still not been named at that stage?
No, and he was a real, well, I can't remember at that stage whether he'd been named or not, but he was a real, Cahill was kind of a real character in many respects. People kind of seen him as a Robin Hood, as you know, he kind of robbed the rich to look after the poor, and that's the kind of reputation he had among the general public, rightly and wrongly. But most of the stuff he did was robberies and burglaries and all that kind of thing. He wasn't as such into drugs in any way, and he wasn't known to be violent, although the movie did portray him as quite violent. I think when he crucified a guy to a pool table. Now, I think such an incident did obviously happen, but he wasn't kind of known as somebody who was going out beating or threatening or shooting people. So there was a degree of kind of empathy for him because he came from a poor area, born in the north side, came from a big family, and then ended up living on the south side of town. But I would have had a lot of interaction with him. And many a day I went down to his house and had conversations with him through the letterbox in the house.
Would he chat away like?
Oh, he'd be like, "What do you want, Martin? Are you the General? You know, fuck off."
You were ultimately looking to find an opportunity.
Yeah, we were basically trying to find him because everyone wanted to know who was him. So, like, basically,
explain that for people listening, because like it's not that easy. You can't just go and name somebody. You either usually have
normally if you went,
normally
if you went and you kind of named somebody as a major criminal, unless you had the evidence and they had a strong criminal record, to show they had a series of different convictions and they had committed various crimes, like no one in the right mind would probably do it because that individual would probably sue you for defamation, and you'd be liable to pay out substantial sums to him via the courts. So everyone... And
ultimately, we would be trying, say as the media, you would be trying to prove what up until that point the Gardaí hadn't been able to with all the resources.
I think that's what the Gardaí were trying to do. They were trying to convict him. You know, that's what they were trying to do.
Exactly.
But they never kind of really got around to that, really, to be honest. They never really did convict him.
Yeah.
But Martin was a very, very clever fella, you know. But we just wanted to, everyone's wondering, this guy, the general, all the papers were writing about him. Who was he? So, the biggest story in town as such was if you could do it, was to name the general. And that's what we went about doing. So we kind of built up a whole dossier and got as much of information on him as we could. And, but he had very little convictions. I think the only convictions we had was really as a child, It was all suspicion, But I think we decided, and the powers that be, to in fairness, and to the credit of the then Sunday World editor, who was a fantastic guy and a brilliant editor at the time, Colin McLennan, like he had the balls, to run it, because Sean Boyne and Mullins and myself and a few others, Cahill O'Shea, we persuaded him that there was serious merit in the story, that it was in the public interest. And how could a guy like Martin Cahill live in this, big posh house, worth huge amounts of money, when he was effectively on the dole? So he was obviously getting the money from somewhere. So the Sunday World and Colin McLennan, the editor, and obviously the then CEO and founder, Jerry McGuinness, would have been involved in that decision, took the view, we'll publish and be damned. And that's what they did. And we named him as Martin Cahill as the general. And that was a massive, massive story at the time. And that night, I remember when we did it, we all decided to go over to Brady's pub. There was 2 pubs in Terranure across the road from the Sunday World that we drank in. One was Martin Morris's on the corner of Terranure Cross, and the other one was Brady's across the road. And for some reason, I decided to move my car out of the Sunday World car park to Brady's across the road. I don't know why, but I did. But anyway, as we celebrated naming the general in the pub that evening and that night, there was a lot of drink taken and everyone was celebrating. Cahill sent a team up the road from Rathmines to the Sunday World office in Terranure and slashed the tires of every car in the car park as a way of getting his revenge for what we had done, except for mine, which was across the road. But I tell you, it was
everyone followed from there on in, and he was then named.
Everyone kind of followed from there on in, and he was then named, But like from what I can remember, he was never like he was associated. He was accused of doing the big O'Connor, the big jewelry robbery in O'Connor's in Harold's Cross. Him and his gang, he was never done. He was never convicted for that. He did the Rusborough House, the Beat art robbery. The paintings that was worth millions. He was involved in that. Again, he was never convicted, and like he was never really convicted as an adult for any of his crimes that he committed.
He did, I suppose, incredible crimes that would be the stuff of movies.
Oh yeah, and then he was involved, of course, in the kidnapping. I wasn't really too much involved in this story, but in the kidnapping of Northern Bank executive Jim Lacey and his family, and he was involved in that. When that one kind of went pear-shaped, and in fact, I think he might have been charged and related to that at the time. He was shot dead. He was quite young when he died. Like he was 45, Martin Cahill, when he was assassinated, and the IRA killed him. There's absolutely, don't take, some people have tried to suggest that it wasn't really them, but I mean, it was, my understanding is it was Cahill. It was the IRA. I've been told by several different sources within the IRA, they definitely killed him. It was a lone gunman. They singled him out because of his association with the loyalist leader, Billy Wright. The fact that there was 2 reasons. I was told one was his involvement in trying to sell the B8 art paintings to Billy Wright, and secondly, he also facilitated and provided overnight accommodation for a loyalist hit team that came to Dublin that tried to shoot up a bar down the Docklands there, and at that time shot dead an IRA member who was on the door of that particular pub that night. And Cahill was accused by Republicans, or suspected by Republicans, of providing accommodation for the loyalist gang that night to get them in and out of Dublin, and that was the second reason why he was picked, singled out, and assassinated by the Republican movement.
Now, he probably didn't get into drugs because he was just a little bit before that all exploded. He was 94, I think, when he was murdered. But
August 94, he was killed. Yeah, he was never really. I think Martin Cahill probably seen, and anyone who grew up in Dublin in the 80s, seen the damage that the whole heroin situation, the whole heroin epidemic in Dublin, and what it did to young people around the city. There was nothing worse than seeing junkies all over the place, and they were going around annoying people and trying to rob people's houses, and they were robbing their own in many cases. And that's why you had the whole, anti-drugs movement that, kind of grew up across the city. And there was a whole anti-Duns fight because Larry Dunn and the whole family, the Duns, were behind much of the heroin at that
Mm,
stage.
mm.
And then, so there was this whole anti-drug movement. And then the Republicans of the IRA, ground level Republican members of the Republican movement, not necessarily IRA members, but members, supporters of the IRA and Sinn Féin members at that time in various working class areas, got involved and helped people get organised to run the junkies out of their areas. And that's what they did. And then I think towards, the tail end of the 80s was when kind of people looked away from heroin and then seen an opportunity in terms of cannabis. And that's when John Traynor, who would have had a lot of business dealings with Cahill and John Gilligan, came to the fore.
Mm. And those who followed. But I suppose the Sunday World, that whole idea of naming the general was, we'll see that as a kind of a changing period for them when going forward it became all about crime. But before that, before the
Well, I
Cahill
would have said that
story,
like the height of the Sunday World as a newspaper was definitely in the 80s and under Colin McClellan's editorship. In those days, when I left Sunday World to go and work in the Star. Believe it or not, the Sunday World decided to set up the Star, and Jerry McGuinness was involved in that. So I was asked by McClellan to move over to the Star, which I duly did, and I was in the Star for about 12 months or so before I was headhunted to go and work for the Star in London. But at that time, the Sunday World, was selling 380,000 on a Sunday. I think it was 282, 3,000 in the Republic and over 100,000 in the North, which was an incredible sale in a country down of 3.5 million. We don't have the population since then has increased from 3.5 to, nearly 5.2. We're heading to 5.3 million. So it was an incredible sale, and also the paper then was fantastic. I think in many ways because there was a great sense of fun and adventure about it,
Mm.
and it was always about the four S's, as I would say. It was all sex, showbiz, scandal, and sport.
Mm.
And as a former tabloid editor, to me that was the four S's, and that was always what I wanted in any tabloid newspaper. And when I went on to edit the Mirror, I made all my decisions based on the four S's and trying to have that mix in the product every day because that's what people wanted.
Mm.
And in the 80s, Colin McClellan and Sean Boyne and Bill Stewart and the whole team certainly gave the readers what they wanted. And there was a fantastic mix to the paper, And it didn't matter what happened. Like the sexy girl on page one, rightly or wrongly, it didn't come off page one. That's the way it was. The amount of, there was a lot of showbiz stories, there was a lot of sex stories. There was a huge amount of stories from rural Ireland. Even the slightest sniff of a sex scandal in rural Ireland, just made the paper.
And it was a different time, of course.
Different. It was different. It was
There was
completely
no
different
internet
time.
there.
There was no internet. There was no such thing as social media. Mobile phones were very few and far between. Look at the papers that you had then. Like on the Sunday, you had the Sunday Independent, the Sunday Press, maybe a bit of the Tribune. I think when it was the Tribune came in, at that stage. Then you had, in tabloid terms, it was really the Sunday World. Sorry, News of the World didn't really have an Irish edition at that stage. They had an Irish correspondent, but they might just do a handful of stories.
Mhm.
And the Sunday Mirror, had Jim Dunn here. It was their correspondent, but they might only do 2 or 3 Irish. Sunday People was the same. They had a correspondent, but they didn't have a full-blown Irish edition. So the Sunday World really had the market to themselves. And the fact that it was colour was so unique at that time. And that's why from the moment it took off in the 70s, the Sunday World just took off from day one. But it had this, they always say that about a tabloid newspaper, there's got to be a rhythm to the book, as we call it. And the rhythm was the four S's, and that's what you needed. And if you wanted to sell, and the paper was action-packed with those type of stories, it was either sex, showbiz, scandal, sport, and from page to page, that's what it was. And there was a lot of funny stories and human interest stories. There really were.
So what kind of things were happening in rural Ireland? Under the cover, under the covers. Is that what the ad was?
Under the covers. I remember. Sean Boyne used to say to me, just go down the country and see, can you get me a few yarns? You'd head off on a Tuesday and you'd come back on a Thursday night and you'd try to have a couple of mad stories from down the country. It could be farmers feuding over land or fighting
Mm.
over land. It could be rows over wills. I
Mm.
mean, there was a great story in Drogheda about a fella called Jerry Campbell who opened up a bar at the back of his house in the Fenians Park housing estate. Then the nearest pub to them was about 2 miles away at the time. So he just opened up this shebeen called Jerry's Bar, and it was all home brewed and he made himself. And he had a TV and he'd darts and he'd pool table, and the place was packed 7 nights a week. And eventually, some neighbours got annoyed and tipped off the cops. So this guy was prosecuted and brought to court and fined whatever he was. But he was a very polite guy, and the point was 50p at the time. And I remember being covering the court case, and then I went up to his house and interviewed him. We did all the pictures, and it ended up being a splash in the Sunday World.
Mm.
About how this guy, was looking after his neighbours because there was no bar near them. So we set up his own pub, and it was 50p a pint, and there was all the pictures. And it was all those kind of real happy-go-lucky stories
Yeah.
that people got a great kick out of and a laugh out of. And of course, Jerry Campbell was the talk of the country. And a lot of the stories in the Sunday World would be followed up by the, pirate stations. Remember, we didn't even have legitimate local radio. It was all pirate stations that we had around the country. Like, we would have had Radio Drogheda or Boyneside Radio then. But every area had its own pirate station. So there was all these kind of stories. Then you would have like the animal cruelty stories as well. People love, you would have had stories about mad dogs, or dog with 6 legs, or a cat with 8 legs and 3 eyes.
A rooster, I recall, was one of the earliest ones I did, about
Yeah.
a rooster who some old woman had somewhere in rural Ireland, and it was annoying the neighbours, so they took her to court, and there was this big kind of drama over this rooster. She was refusing to get rid of it.
And then the other great one, of course, was the potholes, because potholes was such
Oh, yeah,
a huge issue
potholes.
at that point. And
People were
potholes was like,
disappearing down
people were
potholes.
swimming in potholes. Bring out swimming togs. So we used to go and do pothole specials around the place. Like, you'd hit a town and do 5 pubs for Pub Spy, and then you could, go and hit a town or whatever it was, or a village or some place got these giant potholes, and was like,
Yeah.
landing on the moon, and you go and you do all this with a photographer, and there was some wonderful characters in the Sunday World. Like, I always remember with great memories of Andy Devereux. And I suppose some of the listeners might remember what he was always known as, swashbuckling Andy Devereux in the paper. Andy was a bachelor boy from Sutton, but kind of was on the fringes of rock and roll and all his life, and loved going to gigs and drinking what he called his nappers, his brandy every night, and a few odd pints. But Andy used to drive a Granada, but he lived with his mother, Lord Mercer, out in Sutton. But Andy was a sub in the paper, and in the Sunday World, they had what was called a chairman's column, and this was kind of place where Jerry McGuinness, the then owner or the CEO, he sold it to independent newspapers. But Jerry McGuinness there'd be plugs for various ad agencies or businessmen, and the chairman's column. Well, that particular column was very important to the commercial department and to Jerry McGuinness, and Andy's job. Huge responsibility was to sub-edit that. And Andy would sub-edit bits and bobs. But every year he loved Tina Turner.
Right.
And he'd organise a gig abroad in America every year to go and see Tina Turner. And he would organise the flights with Aer Lingus and get a freebie. So he'd organise free flights, and the Sunday World in turn would give publicity to Aer Lingus.
Yeah.
And Andy flew with Aer Lingus, and Andy would fly.
That happened now in RTE, they'd be in trouble.
They'd be in big trouble. I'm sure it did happen in
Perfectly
RTE.
okay.
I'm sure it did happen. I'm sure many of them got cars from various commercial enterprises. But the difference is the Sunday World was not getting taxpayers' money.
Exactly.
That's the difference.
Exactly.
Yeah, but the Sunday World, so Andy would have gone over to do Tina Turner. So he'd go out to America for 2 weeks and line up a load of stories, and he'd go and see Tina's concert, and he'd do a review one Sunday, and then he'd get an interview with her, and it was all from swashbuckling Andy. He was obsessed about the late great Tina Turner. But Andy used to go to various gigs in town, and he dined out on the swashbuckling name, but he was an incredible character, and he used to drive one of the old Ford Granada cars, and he'd come flying into the Sunday World car park every morning. You think he was Ayrton Senna, and he'd be hung over with about 50 hangovers hanging out of him. And then he'd have a cigarette pack. He must have smoked about 40 or 50 cigarettes a day. But Andy was a wonderful character. But he also had a dog, which he loved, a little terrier called Roscoe. And Andy was a very tall guy, bachelor, never married, had various girlfriends, always 20 years, 25, 30 years younger than him over the years. But anyway, when Andy's mother died, her funeral was out in Sutton, Lord of Mercer. Andy arrived at the funeral just like any rock star would, in his black limousine and his black suit and his black sunglasses with Roscoe the dog. And of course, the dog was also wearing sunglasses. So poor mother was up at the top of the, laid out up at the top of the church anyway. And Andy, as the surviving son, and walked up to the length of the church with the dog. And the poor priest at the time came out in a very state of agitation and politely told Andy he couldn't have the dog in the church. Again, these were different times. It's not like now when dogs are treated like babies, you know. We told Andy he'd have to take his dog out in the church. So Andy just turned around to him and told him, "Hey, Padre, no Roscoe, no gig."
The mother wasn't going to be buried.
The mother wasn't going to be buried. There'd be no funeral. And Andy didn't about turn and walk back down the aisle of the church with the dog. Anyway, so after various negotiations, the priest backed down and Roscoe was allowed we're going to Andy's mother's funeral.
Hilariously, I met somebody recently who worked in EMI, which is where all the tickets, presumably for these gigs, were going to be available. And if any freebies were on the go, you would have had to go in. And this guy said to me, Darren Smith, actually, many people know him, but he was saying that he remembers Andy Devereaux coming into the EMI offices with this dog. Now, he didn't remember his name, but he remembered the dog. And he said he used to fart on command, the dog.
I'd say the two of them were probably farting in unison.
With a feed of Guinness and brandy. But anyway, he said
he was
totally pungent, and this dog was like obviously his constant companion.
Yeah. But Andy was a great guy, and was a great character in the Sunday world in those days. I mean, the newsroom in those days was a bit of a madhouse now, to be honest, you know. Like Tuesday, like a lot of people worked a 4-day week. So Tuesday to Friday, a lot of the reporters worked, and there'd be only one reporter on. I mean, think of it, for the biggest paper in Ireland, there might be just one reporter on Saturday, because most of the paper was made up by Friday night. Because of the size of the books. The paper was printed in two segments. Like, you know, you used to have 150, 160 page papers. You know, sometimes the paper was 180 pages. There was that much advertising it.
Yeah.
So, you know, the first segment would be done by Thursday morning, Wednesday night, Thursday morning. And then, you know, the rest would be done nearly, but ready to go. So they'd start printing, you know, as soon as the football, you know, they start printing it around 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, because they go with the UK edition, which used to sell about 20, 30,000. And that'll be printed for us and flown over to London. And then, you know, when they start getting the football results, then they start printing the main edition from around, you know, 7:30. So unless, you know, something major happened, they rarely changed what it was, because they always went with their own spin.
And they sometimes had a fake front on the London edition in case anybody.
Yeah, well, they would if they had a really, really good story. They would do a fake front for the London edition in case
anyone picked it up and stole it.
Absolutely, 100%. You know, but that was probably more in the column. McGinty's days as editor in the 90s. I mean, he took over from McLennan. You know, that they were probably more prone to do that then, and the paper could have changed. It became more crime dependent, and, you know, some more full of crime stories.
The stories would have been more liftable, in other words. If you had a story that
would have been far more liftable, you know.
You wouldn't be lifting a story if you had the exclusive photographs, the exclusive interview and all the rest.
There was a hell of a lot of, you know, there's far more crime stuff. And then Paul Williams was doing great stuff, to be fair to him, in the paper at the time. And, you know, there was a huge reliance on him, and Mick McNiff was there, and it was Ferry Siller's really brilliant reporters. You know, and it was, you know, there was a huge reliance on them. But getting back to the 80s, like, you also had a lot of, like, the women's read. There was a huge reading in the Sunday World then for women. Like, Micheline McCormick was absolutely brilliant. And, like, you know, she kind of pioneered modern day women's coverage in newspapers as we know it. Like the Agony Aunt, all these, you know, various stories about, you know, how your body works, dealing with issues like contraception, sex, all that kind of stuff. Like, it was a different country in the 80s, you know. And I mean, you know, we didn't, you know, there was still contraception was banned. You know, people still couldn't get divorced. It was a completely different country. Like, the Catholic Church still had a huge amount of power, because the sex scandals hadn't really started to break. It wasn't until the 90s that the sex scandals in the church, you know, really came to the forefront and broke.
But you must have been, when you were there in the 80s, I was going to say to you, rural Ireland was full of these bright, sparkling, funny stories of these big characters and all the rest of it. But there must have been a darker side to it then, and you must have been hearing rumours of that.
Of course there was. And there was often rumours whereby, you know, there was priests who, you know, had left the church and run off with the housekeeper, and we would have done a couple of them stories. You know.
What about, because
but in terms of the sex abuse, the sex abuse didn't really start coming out as such
It didn't start breaking until about the 90s,
No,
did it?
no. There was a lot of, you would have had various incest cases in courts in Ireland
Mm.
in the 80s, you know, and there was some horrible cases of abuse that we did cover in the Sunday World. But the ones involved the clergy in the 80s was very few and far between. It was only in the 90s that these stories started to come out.
So I remember probably working with you in the Mirror at the time when those stories, those
Yeah,
court cases started
yeah,
about a
yeah,
priest,
yeah.
was, found guilty or, pleaded guilty or something like that. And it was the undoubted splash. Nothing rivaled it when those
No.
stories started it. And I remember seeing them start to make their way inside the paper and then start to become single columns
Yeah, well, that's
as we
because,
got used to
yeah,
it.
well, it's a bit like now. Like if you look at the country now, when I was a cub reporter in the early 80s, and I started off in 1981 in the Drogheda Independent, like if there was 3 murders a year in Ireland, that was it.
Mm,
And a murder then, like in 1981, was such a huge story. It would run for 2 weeks. It'd be on the front of the Indo, the front of the
yeah,
Evening Herald, Evening Press, like non-stop for 2 weeks. It was
yeah.
just huge. And you wouldn't leave an area if you went down to cover a story until it was all coming to an end and somebody was arrested. But now we've gone from having 3 murders a day in Ireland to nearly a murder every day.
Yeah, yeah.
And like a large amount of them. I'd say the vast majority of the murders in this country are domestic.
Mm.
You know, most of them. Like there's very few actual, random murders as such that,
No, they're very rare.
and very rare. And the ones outside of that, a lot of them are crime related, are gang related. So if you take out domestic and gang related, the number of people then being killed are very few. The random attack or random killings as such are few and far between. But it's actually frightening the amount of domestic violence there is and the amount of domestic murders, and particularly the amount of women who are being killed
Mm.
is absolutely frightening and horrific. So there's obviously a huge problem there in society that going forward that we have to deal with. But getting back to the 90s, like it just became. Sexual abuse committed by priests just became so common that it went from being front page news for days on end to tops, as we'd call them, short piece of maybe 8 or 10 paragraphs inside the paper. And
Mm.
that just shows you because there was only so much sex abuse you can cover because
Yeah,
eventually the readers just got sick of it.
yeah, yeah.
And torn away. So in any newspaper, you just got to limit the green. And it's like murders, you get to cherry pick murders as an editor, as a journalist. But what murders we put on page one? Well, one that's going to be of interest, is the answer. But like every murder really should be the same. But it was a bit like the sex abuse with the murders. We got to cherry pick them,
Yeah,
which is a
yeah.
shocking really place to be. But
It
that's what
is, but I
happens
suppose that, in the end
in
of
the
the
news
day,
cycle.
unless you're the state-funded media, you are actually, it is a commercial entity that you're working for.
Well, it's a
And
total commercial entity, and you're either going to live and die by yourselves, and there's nobody else there to pick up the bills.
yeah,
So what you spend, you ought to run a business and you make a profit. And if you don't make a profit, you die and you shut down, and all your workers are laid off. And that's the way it is. You don't have this, public service. You don't have the government or the state coming in to bail you out every time you need a couple of quid.
mm,
You
mm,
know, and that's the difference between RTE and everybody else involved in the media in this country.
mm. Going back to the sort of the 80s and those days, you were in the Sunday world and sex was obviously a big part of it. But like people
I once got attacked and condemned by a bishop
for
for writing a sex story.
condemned from the
And it was
pulpit.
condemned from the pulpit.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in my hometown in
Oh,
Drogheda.
God.
Yeah, yeah.
How
It was
exciting.
I wrote a story about sheet parties, and this was a story. Probably some people might find this terribly rude, but it was about sex parties basically happening involving men and women in a house in Drogheda with a sheet put across the room and holes in the sheet, and the women couldn't see
Sorry,
the other
sorry, sorry.
side.
I thought you were saying a sheep.
No, sheet party.
I thought that was your accent, you see. I
No,
thought, and I was
no,
going,
no,
this is gonna,
sheet.
I'm gonna have to get this edited. This is too much.
No,
But no.
sheet parties.
Okay, that's okay.
So a sheet was put across the room with holes in them at the waist. So people would swap over and go the other side,
Right.
and they would pick the various partners from the size of their what that
Okay.
was put through the hole in the sheet. So these parties were going on at a certain
Only in
house,
Drogheda.
at a housing estate in Drogheda. So for legal reasons, we couldn't name the housing estate. So we just put in, so rather than, we said the Boyne Valley, the Boyne as another term apart from Drogheda, Boyne
Yeah.
Valley area, whatever it was. Now, there was in a housing estate called Boyne Valley in Drogheda at the time. There was the Boyne Valley Hotel, and there was a housing estate beside it called, there wasn't a housing estate called the Boyne Valley. There was an estate beside it just called Stameen. So everybody kind of assumed it was in there. But anyway, this story was massive. And it was the talk of everybody in Drogheda. And in fact, it was the talk of the whole country, these sheep parties.
Yeah.
So, of course, the Sunday World loved it. Got a great sales out of it. Sean Boyne was as happy as Larry, the news editor. And but my local bishop, Lord Emerson, Bishop Lennon, took a very dim view. And my father, Lord Emerson, was equally a very religious man. But anyway, I was condemned in the pulpit at Mass on the Sunday.
Named and shamed.
Named and shamed by the late Bishop Lennon for bringing the whole of Drogheda into disrepute. We're writing about these shocking parties.
How'd your father take that?
Not very well. Well, he didn't take it very well, me writing a story. He sided with the bishop, actually.
Yeah.
Because the bishop was a good buddy of his. And
But that kind of thing would have
it was
been...
shocking, and that stuff like that shouldn't be put out there, and we shouldn't have been writing about.
But that kind of thing was like not, it was secretive, and okay, we haven't heard about those, but like it was such a closed society, wasn't it? There was no divorce.
Well, I just happen to know one guy who actually went to these things. Right. That's how I found out about this story.
He's a friend of yours, is he?
That was just somebody I knew who went
just asking for a friend.
No.
Just know about this for a friend.
Like, obviously can't receive my story. It was actually not that Sunday. It was the week later the bishop had a go at me. And then I met him in the town about 2 or 3 weeks after that. And he was walking around with his bicycle, and he had another go at me, and him and I had it out because I wasn't too happy with him, and I wasn't too happy with his church and the way they've been behaving over certain things.
It's splashing itself in those days.
In those days, yeah.
I had a shindig with the bishop on the street. But like, so, it's hard to imagine now, and, things have moved on. Society has moved on. The media has moved on. The media is a completely different animal now. But back then, it would have been legitimate to write about people having affairs, about people's homosexuality, for example, because that was people, newspapers were writing about that and outing people, mainly tabloid media up until probably the 1990s. I mean, that's hard to believe, isn't it? But that was the kind of stuff. And that was sort of titillating really to probably a rural Ireland that didn't...
Yeah, well, I think the outing of gay or people who were homosexual, whatever, that was more of a British thing.
Yeah,
that was a more
or a showbiz thing.
Yeah, but it was more something that the British tabloids did.
When you think about that, now,
and particularly
it is so
like the Sun in Britain, would have done a good bit of that now.
Isn't it shocking? Like when you talk
when you
about
think
this
about it now, yeah,
that it happened in our lifetime.
Yeah, I know, yeah, but it's different times. Like, like editors in the 80s and in the 70s in Ireland, like would have been under huge pressure from the church over stuff that they were running. They would have been under huge pressure from the politicians and the government over stories at the moment. Like, it was just a different time, Like a politician wouldn't dare ring an editor now and get them to try and stop a story, because they'd just be destroyed, because the editor would take the conversation and just turn them over, and the public would take a very dim view. But in those days, these are the things that went on, Now, I remember being slaughtered by PJ Mara over some story I wrote in the Star about Charlie High, or for asking him awkward questions at a press conference. And, PJ Mara tackling me and having a really right go at me, really aggressive on the phone and being threatening to me, Well, in fairness to PJ Mara, like, he was, at the end of the day, was a pretty good soul. A couple of hours later, he came and he sought me out and apologised and brought me for a pint in the Dáil bar. And then it all just passed over. But that was the type of thing that went on. I mean, there was a lot of pressure put on people in those days, and you have to respect, people like the great editors, as I used to call them. You have to kind of respect the likes of Vinnie Doyle and Tim Pakuyan, who always stuck to their guns and followed their own instinct and never let anyone intimidate them. And also, I have to hand it to Tony O'Reilly. Tony O'Reilly, was never interfered in his papers, to be fair to him, in all the years. As did Jerry McGuinness. Jerry McGuinness was happy once, somebody got a little mention on his chairman's page. That's all he ever asked. He never interfered in the news agenda. Neither did Tony O'Reilly. Like, Tony O'Reilly, didn't go around trying to pick the government as such, or did the O'Reilly family, to be fair to them. and they employed a lot of people over the years.
Mm.
And Vinnie Doyle was certainly one of the greatest editors of all time in this country.
Mm. And what about the idea that sex was for sale in this country in the 1980s? Were you, or were they the days that
Yeah,
there was a
sex
lot of
was for
brothel
sale. Yeah,
busts
yeah.
and
We
all
used to
that?
do we used to do what they call a brothel bust in the Sunday World, and Sean Boyne would call us all in on a Tuesday, and there could be 6 or 8 of us, and reporters and photographers, and we were sent out. There was illegal magazines. There was a magazine going out around Dublin at that time. I think it was in Dublin. Had all the addresses. Had all these addresses and phone numbers of all these massage parlours around the country, around Dublin. Now these massage parlours were brothels.
Mm.
So basically, people went in for massages, and then one thing led to another, and you could get various services of what you wanted, and I'll leave it to people's imagination. But at the end of the day, if you wanted to have full sex with a prostitute, that's exactly what you had. And basically, these masseurs were prostitutes, and many of them, most of them, were Irish,
Mm.
and it's not called the oldest profession for nothing. So Sean Boyne would send us all out, and we'd have to go into these massage parlors, and you'd have the photographer outside take pictures, and you go in and go on the cover and get stripped off, and you know they would then start massaging you, and then ask you then if you wanted any extra, and then you were told what the extras were on offer, and it was 10 quid for this, and 20 quid for that, and 30 quid for the other, and 40 quid if you wanted the full Monty or whatever you wanted, and or for half an hour or whatever. And then of course, we all had to make our excuses and leave, because if you did go ahead and have commit any kind of a sex act with this lady tonight, you were going to completely, from a legal point of view, mess up the investigation. But basically, Sunday World used to do these kind of brothel busts 4 times a year or whatever it was, and they'd name and shame all these various brothels and publish pictures of them, and all the various reporters would do a piece on each place they went into, and what the lady was like, and what she blonde or brunette or whatever it was, and that was a kind of a regular thing that went down the paper. So yeah, sex did play a big part in selling the paper, and
And
that's why a lot of people in rural Ireland bought the Sunday World, and why they kind of would be coming out. Some people would be coming out at the shop with the Sunday World hidden inside the Sunday Press, or hidden inside the Sunday Independent, or
because they wanted
you
to
know,
read about this, sounds like really hard work, Jumbo.
it was very difficult, very, very, very hard work for some people, I can tell you.
It also sounds like a real man's world as a journalist.
Uh, Probably there was a bit of a boys' club as such, but in the Sunday
Women wrote
World,
features, wasn't that the way it was?
but you had like Cathy Kelly in the Sunday World. You had Michelle McCormick, my own sister Marie worked there for a while. Um, you had a number of women were there, but they weren't as such in the front line as kind of the force women. There were, it's like, I mean, to be fair, there were women who were very good news reporters on other papers.
Mm.
In the
Nan
80s.
McCafferty and
Well, yeah, Nan McCafferty was one, but I mean, in the Catherine Donnelly in the Irish Independent, she's still there. But there was very other ones in the Irish press. Maeve Sheehan, like there was loads, like there was many of them in the Irish press at that time, and
just weren't doing
and
this
there
sort
was
of work.
and there was many of them during the end. There just wasn't as many in the Sunday World. The Sunday World kind of was a bit of a boys' club.
Yeah, and it sounds
And we
very
used to
rough
all-
and tumble.
It
sort of
was
work.
rough and tumble, and there was big booze and culture. There was a big womanizing culture. The lads, we used to go out, we'd work hard and we'd play hard, and we used to be down in Leeson Street because we were all earning huge amounts of money, buying wine and champagne and all the rest of it in the 80s, which a lot of people had no money in the 80s, but we had plenty of money because we were making a lot of money in the Sunday World then. And we were all out, we're all kids, all in our 20s, so we were out and enjoying ourselves, and we were clubbing it around Dublin, and we didn't have to pay in anywhere, and we partied. We certainly partied 3 or 4 nights a week.
Yeah. Most definitely.
Like there was
And
no
Brady's educated their entire
and Brady's was
generations out of it.
it was a hell of a place to go, and we had great fun in there, But it was like, to be honest, yeah. To answer your question, it was a boys' club, but that wasn't that wasn't deliberate. It kind of changed then. Joanne McElgun came on board then, I think in the 90s, around the time I was leaving. She was in there actually before she came in. So there was, and she was a very, very good news reporter.
And I think I have to say, and I could be wrong, but I've
There
never
wasn't
heard.
it wasn't as if it was an anti-women
That's
thing.
what I was going to say.
There was
I've never
huge
heard
respect for women.
anyone. I've never heard anyone complain about their time in the Sunday World
No.
for any of those reasons. Okay, there'd be a couple of very rude comments made or whatever like that. But most people were able for it, women that
But the
went in
women who
there
went
and
in there were well able to fight their own corner. Yeah,
yeah,
Pauline Cronin, of course, she was there and she was
yeah.
a news reporter, but she did news stories and she did TV stuff and features. And I think she was a press officer in the RTE now, but she was there, you know.
Mm, mm.
But they had like they all just did what they had to do, and they were all tough women. Like they were all
Most
well
women
able
had
to. They were all
yeah,
able to say their piece and
yeah.
say what they thought, and they certainly did hang back. Like Cathy Kelly was always one to speak her mind, but
Mm,
they were also good fun. Like it wasn't. What I mean, it was a boy. It was a sense of fun. Like there was a great emphasis putting on fun, and that like if you enjoyed yourself doing your job and getting the stories that we got, it also reflected in the paper. And the paper was very much a happy paper. Like when you read the Sunday World on Sunday, like we didn't want to feel like so I suppose this is an expression you would have said then, but you wouldn't say now. Like you can't, I probably can't say, but I wouldn't have put you in bad humor,
yeah,
shall we say. The
yeah.
Sunday World would have made you laugh
Hmm.
and give you a bit of crack and a bit of a laugh, and it was a sense of fun. And what we were trying to do, and the editor was trying to do, was to entertain people.
Mm,
It was seen as Sunday entertainment, and that's what it was.
and it certainly worked. So, Jumbo Kearns, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Nick.